And I think, based on past experience, even though I know we've got a lot of questions bubbling, it will be good for me to go on to the next study. So we'll add that to what we have available. So if you join me now on page 5, I'm either going to introduce or remind you of Plato's story of the cave. Now we are, if you find that timeline thinking helpful, we are, let's just say, roughly about 400 BC with Plato, as we were with Aristotle. Now the sequence, the actual sequence, would be first the pre-Socratics like Heraclitus. I call them the warm-up band for Greek philosophy. And then after that come Socrates first, and then Socrates' philosophical son, so to speak, is Plato. And then comes Aristotle, you could think of as Socrates' grandson. Now, there is overlap. So, Plato spent time at the feet of or walking around with Socrates. And actually, Plato is the person who wrote most everything that we know about Socrates. There's also some stuff in Herodotus, the kind of famous Greek historian. But so goes Socrates, then Plato, then Aristotle. I started with what I considered the order of importance and talking about language and logos first. And so now I'm backtracking a little bit to catch Plato. And then pretty much after I get these two done, we're on a historical chronological track with the thinkers. We are then in the period of Greek or ancient philosophy, which I framed by being from 400 BC to 400 AD. And I characterize this as the courting or the starting to date reason. Now, because of the discussion we were just starting to have, you may realize that I think it's helpful to say the Greeks were working to be reasonable or reason things out. But it's also the case that this is the first opportunity really to pay attention to logos and language. Okay, so the Greeks did get this mixed up in the course of time, but that's roughly the thing. So this is the start of philosophy. Now we come to Plato. So Plato, as I said, is the favorite pupil of Socrates, or at least the most memorable person out of that those around Socrates. Plato's, bless you, Plato has a great deal of interesting stuff to offer. A lot of people, certainly students starting off in this, generally think that Plato is the really fun, exciting philosopher, and Aristotle is a little bit more boring, maybe a lot more boring, just like, your university college professor. So the reason for that is that even though both Plato and Socrates wrote dialogues, and both had their class lectures taken down as notes. For some reason, in the case of Plato, what happened was that all of the class notes were lost and most of the dialogues survived. So the dialogues are lively and exciting, sometimes a little mystifying, but I mean, they're just wonderful vehicles for having the discussion. They're like little versions of disputations, but in a character to character format. It's quite wonderful. On the other hand, with Aristotle, we actually know that Aristotle had written dialogues because a little later on, Cicero, the famous Roman philosopher orator, referred to Aristotle's dialogues as being even more scintillating and exciting than Plato's. But alas, we don't have any of those. So all we've got is the quote unquote boring class notes. So that's why people think about Aristotle and Plato rather differently. And then, incidentally, for those of us who are used to having the Hebrew from Moses and the prophets and the Greek from the apostles and the evangelists, there actually is a fascinating wrinkle with Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy actually was lost to the West, heading down to the time of Augustine. So Augustine knew only some of Plato, had a little bit of Aristotle's logic, and those books, those manuscripts kind of frittered away and were lost. It was the Muslim people who actually kept the philosophy alive, and this will be fascinating, retranslated what they had preserved from Plato and Aristotle, for instance, back into Hellenic Greek. And then later on, that became available to the West. So you may be aware of this from some time ago. There was a book entitled How the Irish Saved Civilization. The manuscripts went with the Irish, and the monks and so forth took care of this. And then it was there when people wanted to read it again. You could actually say um, that the Arab philosophers saved Socrates and Plato for civilization. So when we talk about Socrates and Plato, there's no such thing as a verbatim verbal inspiration, something or another kicking around in there. Okay, so Plato. Now, I think that the best place to meet Plato is, of course, in the dialogues that he wrote about Socrates, and then that Plato went on to write about his own developing philosophy. There is another indication of how boring philosophers are with their titles and their categorizations of things. So Plato's scintillating dialogues are divided into three different phases. There is the early phase, the middle phase, and the late phase. How inspiring is that, right? So the early phase dialogues are those in which Plato is basically writing down conversations that Socrates had. So, for instance, the trial of Socrates, which is the apology. The middle dialogues are dialogues which we are quite sure um, never happened in the way they're being recorded, but they're teaching devices for Plato to carry out the first look at his philosophy, working it out in these dialogues. And in those cases, Socrates often features as a character in the dialogue, but we do know that that's not something that Socrates had a conversation about. That's the case with Republic, which we're going to look at. So Republic is a middle dialogue. And then there are the late dialogues. Some of the late dialogues were really familiar to medieval thinkers. For instance, Plato's Laws, which gave the Christian medieval thinkers kind of a starting point to talk about creation, sort of. Don't overdo that. But those are generally don't receive a lot of attention today, in my view. So this is a middle dialogue. In this middle dialogue, the Republic, there is what I would call a must-know Western metaphor, the story of the cave. I told my undergrads that if you find yourself heading across the stage to pick up your diploma from Concordia University and you realize that you never read and studied Plato's Cave, you should ask for your money back instead of taking that diploma. Right? It's that kind of thing. Also, just to be a little self-serving, some years ago, Brian Wolfmiller and I did an audio series called Master Metaphors for Philosophy. And I love doing interviews with him because he makes me seem like I have a sense of humor and like I've got something, really important to share with people. I don't tell anybody else. He's just my favorite interviewer for that reason. So that's actually up online, but this is where I'm going to sneak in my first of many advertisements. I also have a very popular active teaching platform called Lutheran Philosopher. So it's lutheranphilosopher.com, and we're archiving all of this stuff. So it's not quite right for me to take Brian's stuff and put it there. He's keeping his own stuff on YouTube. But we agreed if we were both participating, I can archive it on my site too. So we've got this whole series up, and you can actually hear, I think we talked for 60 or 90 minutes about things such as Plato's Cave, Augustine's Story of the Pairs, and then one or two things having to do with machines and computers, some thought experiments by modern philosophers. So just saying, if you're looking for more, and who wouldn't want more of this fascinating stuff we're talking about? Lutheran Philosopher may be a site you can use or recommend to your university or college age students. I think we do a very good job of showing the substance, the substance of Christ, even while doing good philosophy. Well, it's because of that substance we're doing good philosophy. So here comes Plato's Cave. I don't know if you shouldn't have taken your college degree because somebody slipped up and didn't teach you Plato's Cave, but I can write you an extra credit for this. Maybe that'll help. So I'm going to tell you this story. This is from Republic Book 7. Now, something that will make you more comfortable getting back to or reading Republic, if this is at all interesting, is that Republic is that dialogue I mentioned this morning, which has the word polis city state in the title. If you've had a political theory course or you've done some reading from a political philosopher, you likely would have heard of the city state that's set out in the course of Republic with the three classes of people who make this work. But actually, Republic is a book about the human soul. So for Plato, there's a kind of a tripartite soul. And remember that the soul is the human being. He actually says that the body is the dungeon in which the soul is imprisoned. Okay. So the three parts of the soul, and this is worth knowing also, um, tumblers may click together because this is actually the view of the human soul that C.S. Lewis uses. All right. So there's no better picture of the human soul than the human body. The 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein said that. And I think this is just an obvious thing. So for Plato, the soul is patterned after the body. The three parts of the soul then are the intellect for the head. Then if you jump down to the third part, from the diaphragm down, that would be the seat of the desires. And in between, so diaphragm up to the neck, this would be the chest area. And this is the area of, as C.S. Lewis says, the emotions. So when Lewis laments the fact that students are not being educated emotionally, which is a big failure of education since World War II at least, right? He says that the problem is that we're cranking out men without chests. Yeah. That's that reference to Plato. I just want to defend this briefly. I think this is extremely interesting because instead of just saying the soul is everything that's not the physical part, this is talking about the capacities of our minds or our souls. So the intellect is pretty clear. And I think that business with the appetites also stands to reason, because if you're picking a part of the body, from the diaphragm down, that's going to be hunger and the sex drive and so forth right there. So that makes a lot of sense. This area in the middle, though, about emotions takes some work for us as moderns to pay attention to. But I mean, just look at me right now. So I wouldn't be operating too well without my head because I wouldn't, right? I wouldn't have my capacity for the brain power and everything. If I am in pretty good, I'm going to say spiritual shape. So if I'm feeling that rest in Christ and his gospel, if I'm thinking I'm doing something that just makes me feel good about serving Christ and his people by being up here, you're going to notice it from my posture. I've also got some experience with things in uniform too. So many of you will know this. That's of course why soldiers, when they're at attention, are it's the chest out, right? So it's all synced emotionally as well. So what we've got then is Plato's thesis for Republic is that the person is acting morally. The question for each Socratic dialogue is a different question in the form, what is X? Where X is a major moral item for human beings. And the Socratic question then for Republic is, what is justice? By the way, in Greek, that is from the DK word group. So the dikaiosine showing up in Paul in Romans does have this kind of etymological history back to Plato too. In Homer, DK pops up, I think, in the Iliad only once or twice, and it's basically a road or a path that people follow. In Plato, it becomes the right path to follow. And then you get to justification in Romans, and there, that's the crescendo, justification by Christ alone. Huh. Right. So then to take a hold of that question, what is justice? Plato's thesis is that justice is the human soul when all three parts are each doing their job, operating in harmony. So the notion of harmony is kind of there for justice. So when the boys, the guys, Socrates and the guys, are working at this, they say, let's make a large print edition of the human soul so we can talk about the human soul. And then they say, oh, I know what we'll do is we'll make a large print edition of the human soul in the form of a polis, a city state. So the head will be the people who rule in the city state. The part from the diaphragm down will be the artisans and the people who kind of motivate things. And the middle section will be the National Guard. This is the soldiers, right? So in here, this is what protects and keeps things together. These are the leaders. And by the way, that lower or third part of the soul isn't rejected. Where would we be if we didn't have, the feeling that we're hungry? Maybe we were hungry, maybe we weren't for that nice lunch that was provided. But if you were never hungry, I think eventually you die pretty quickly, right? Also, the sex drive is not inherently evil, and so forth. Okay, so when each part is doing its special work for the sake of the whole. So the city, you have a good city state when the leaders are leading according to the idea of the good, and the emotions are pulling things together and keeping this motivated and patriotic, we might almost say. And then the lower part would be the working people and so forth. All right, so that idea about the good then, that becomes the central feature of the story of the cave. All right, so it's having to do with the soul, but the soul done according to these three classes in this large edition of the soul, which is called the polis or city state. All right, so here's the story of Plato's cave. I don't know how much I'm free to move around and still stay on our camera up here, so you'll just kind of getting this from the back. Okay. My director in the back is saying this far and no farther. Yeah. So we could think about this since we're sort of underground right here. All right. Let's say that this is a deep cave, and I know your study is to my left. Aaron, what's that room off to my right or to your left shoulder? It's just a room. Okay, we're going to say whatever that room is back there, that's going to be the opening to outside. So never mind the windows, take those out. Never mind the lights. We've just got a cave here, but it's inclined this way. And to get up out of the cave, you'd be going out into the light by going through that room. Okay, so we start out at the deepest part of the cave, and this is where things begin. So Plato tells us to see that at the deepest part of the cave, there is a lineup of people. These people are sitting on the floor here, and in a truly macabre detail, they are all manacled, hand, feet, and necks. So they're chained up in such a way that sitting here, all they can do is look at this wall. Now, in looking at that wall, what those people think they are watching is city life in Athens or the polis or wherever, because they're seeing what they take to be people walking around back and forth and animals mooing and purring or whatever they're doing up there, right? Because they're seeing these, and then they're also hearing the sounds of the animals and the sounds of people talking. Now, things get started when one person is somehow freed from those shackles and those chains and turns around. Now, this is a big moment in any good novel, right? If the person turns around, this is conversion. This is enlightenment. This is metanoia, what we would call repentance, or what would be called repentance later on in the New Testament. So this individual turns around, and here's what he discovers. These people have been watching shadows on the wall. What he sees is that there is a fire going in the middle of the cave here. And between the fire and these people chained and looking at the wall, there are people, and they're it's variously translated as they're puppeteers or they're actors who are making shadow plays on the walls. I was thinking for a while it would be fun to apply for a sabbatical to learn how to do shadow figures so I could tell the story. I think I could have pulled it off. Maybe I did. I don't know. Okay, so they're making these shadows on the wall to look like people and animals, and they're making the sounds. So this is in effect a surround sound theater, yeah, with a big TV on the wall. There's nothing real there. So what's happening is just shadows and sounds behind the scenes. All right, so he sees this. We got the deal with the fire. Now, because he is on a bit of a roll, there was something behind what we were mistaking for reality, he continues to walk toward the way out of the cave. And what he finally does is he gets over there to the door and he steps outside. Now, the first reaction that he has stepping out into the sunlight is one of pain and, looking down. If you ever had contact lenses and they were in a little bit too long, or remember pulling a couple all-nighters and the eyes are sandpaper, you get the picture. So the guy's looking down, and what he first accustoms to, so the first thing he sees is reflections in puddles or brooks of water out here, the reflections of the blue sky and maybe a few clouds, such as you might have over Greece. Okay. He's still thinking, though, what's behind what I was taking for reality? Now he finally acclimates to the great outdoors, and he looks up and he sees the sun. And the sun, he realizes, explains the continuation of life on Earth. And at the same time, it provides the illumination so that you can see what is really happening. Okay, so far? So, for unexplained reasons, this person decides he's going to go back into the cave. Now, he comes back into the cave. If I weren't out of range, I would have walked back there. He comes back in the cave, and because he's been blinded by the light, he's bumping into, I suppose, the stalactites and stalagmites, the walls of the cave. So he seems to be drunk. All right, so he's bumbling back and forth here, and he comes over to these people seated, still chained and looking at the wall, thinking the shadows are reality. And he says to all of them, listen, I found out what is the real basis for reality and what's behind it all. Let me teach you about it. And they kill him. That's the end of the story. Right now, there are two questions that we've got to get at. The first one is, who is that guy that got up, and what in the world is going on here? What's this all about? What is it a metaphor for? Well, the person is Socrates. I mentioned before that Plato did write the Apology, which, by the way, is an important thing to study if you want to know what Peter meant when he said, we must always be ready to give an apologion, right? So he wrote that. That's the actual trial for Socrates. But you might say that this is his friend and most famous student's retelling of the trial of Socrates, to catch the impact of it, to catch what's going on. It wasn't just another trial. So this is Socrates, and Socrates gets killed for asking the Socratic questions, doesn't he? What is justice? And some of the early questions were, what is religious obligation or piety? What is the law? And all these big questions, you'll notice, by the way, that they're all demanding a definite, true, universal answer. None of this taking opinions about the Thebans and the Spartans and the Athenians and the barbarians. What do they think morality is? But it's, what is it? And of course, asking those questions, teaching his students to ask those questions of the people in power, was exactly what got Socrates killed. All right, so now the other question, at least as big, is what's going on with this story of the cave? So I would say that the key to this is to think about the aboutness of the thinking. In 20th century thought, we talk about this character to thinking and to our emotions and to our will. We call it intentionality. So contrary to what Descartes was peddling, it is not the case that you can just think and only find yourself in your own thinking mind and not be able to get out of that. Anytime you're thinking, you're always thinking about something. Now, those are not two phases. That is what thinking is. You're thinking about something. You might, by the way, be thinking about something imaginary, but you're thinking about an object. So that's intentionality. So the thing here is to think about what's being thought about at each phase. So at the lowest level, literally in the story, right? At the lowest level, these people are thinking about those shadows and those passing sounds in the air. They think that stuff is reality. That's such a low kind of thinking that it's barely worth the title thinking at all, because The stuff they're thinking about is there for a fraction of a second, if at all, and then gone. Poof, poof, poof. Bible readers will recognize shades of Ecclesiastes in that, I suppose. Right? That's the Havel. So, anyhow, the object is very fleeting, if there's anything there at all. Then, when you go out here and take a look at the fire, by the way, the fire would be the element of the four elements that is most associated with Heraclitus. It changes, but it doesn't change. So some people think there's kind of a moment of thinking about Heraclitus' notion of the logos there in the middle of the cave for just a minute. But anyhow, the fact is that if you're thinking about the fire and you're thinking about these guys doing that, that lasts longer, but it's not everlasting. So it's longer, it's more real, if you will. So that level of thinking is a bit better because the object is more long lasting. Now, when you get outside the cave, when the character Socrates looks down, I think the giveaway here is the word that's used for what he's seeing as those reflections. And the Greek word that's used there is mathematica. Mathematica. So I think rather than thinking numbers, we want to think geometry for this. Plato was just obsessed with geometry. So looking down then would be, for instance, looking at Euclidean figures like triangles or parallel lines. How long do those things last? Well, they'd be a candidate for lasting forever if you think about it a certain way. No drawn triangle lasts forever, but did your geometry teacher do this in high school? I had two absolutely brilliant teachers for geometry in high school. These guys won state and regional recognition for their work. Not that I was a great student, but they were just always bringing something out. So, one day we came in and Mr. Gilbert had all of the blackboards filled with triangles. And just hundreds. We came in, he had somebody go up there and he said, point at any one of those things that you want to. And he said, what's this? And the class said a triangle, and he erased it. So what's this? It's a triangle, erase it. Erased them all, and then said, do you know what a triangle is? Everybody said, well, sure. It's a three-sided figure, the interior angles of which total 180 degrees. It feels eternal, doesn't it? It just always is that. Okay, so that is a more long-lasting object to thought and therefore a better way of thinking. And then finally, the question is, pardon me? No, we're okay? Yeah. Finally, the question is then, what's going on with the sun? The sun is the idea of the good. The sun is the stand-in for the idea of good, which is what makes anything that's morally good. So idea is very deliberate. This is the exact term that Plato uses. And then, by the way, bequeathed to Western thought in a big way. It comes from eidos, and it means to see. So our whole vocabulary for thinking generally is visual. Somebody, I think it was back in the early mid-20th century, wrote a book called The Hegemony of Vision. And it was about how we think about thinking in the West. All right, so the idea of the good, then the idea of the good is if you know that somebody is a good person, or if you know that a thing is a good whatever it is, the basis on which you know that is your soul has had some contact, however fleeting, with the idea of the good. And you're measuring something to be good based on an external, eternal standard. I said it feels a lot like geometry or Euclidean geometry. All right, so that's what's going on. So those four things. And then if you would like to draw an arrow through the middle of all of this, the question then is, what is thought accomplishing, especially when you get to the higher thinking, which is done about the more long-lasting objects? And this is Gnosticism. This is progressively better thinking. It's like some sort of ladder to ultimate reality. Fascinating thing, Plato himself said, the idea of the good is, quote, beyond all being. So that's his way of securing that it can't change. I think that a hymn that comes to mind for us that, in a way, um, overwrites Plato's cave, very importantly, is Abide with Me, right? Change and decay in all I see, O thou who changest not, abide with me. And Plato certainly couldn't begin to address that. He's not talking about God as being the good up there, but he's getting as close as he can to God's ultimate enduring reality, or something like that. Do you see? So this is a fascinating thing because it is as non-relativistic as all get out. So a thesis that I always had offered to my introductory classes is Western philosophy was founded to combat postmodern relativism. So you have, I mean, just think about this. You have Protagoras. Man is the measure of all things, of things that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not. So Socrates, then Plato, then Aristotle all knew that if the Greeks swallowed that, that would be the end of Greek culture, because they were having a tough enough time holding those city states together, as you know. But to think that everybody gets to relativize, right? So in comes Socrates, and his response to Protagorean relativism is the Socratic question. What is the law? What is justice? You see, this is talking about the reality of a universal absolute. Plato's answer to Protagorean relativism, or what we call postmodernism, his answer is the story of the cave, the idea of the good. And Aristotle responds to it with his definition of truth. So in Metaphysics 4, Aristotle says this is the definition of truth, or speaking the truth. To say that what is not, or that what is not is to speak a lie. To say that what is, and what is not, is to speak the truth. Do you hear? It's like he's got Pythagoras open. Man is the measure of all things, of things that are, that they are. And he's saying, no, to speak the truth is to speak in line, to correspond your thinking and your speaking with what is the case.
This is Aristotle.
That's Aristotle. Metaphor, Metaphysics Book 4.
So how does he treat the case of, and I talk to my parents about this because they're big into what's truthiness.
It's what?
Truthiness.
Truthiness.
So you could talk to two soldiers who were, because he was in Vietnam. You could talk to two soldiers that were in the Vietnam War. And one soldier had this experience, and this soldier had something completely different, but they're both true, even if they conflict with each other. So it's truthiness.
Yeah.
So how is that for?
Well, the response is that's silliness. So that would be to look at this in a Protagorean way. When Aristotle is quite insistent on this, so this is called the correspondence theory of truth. And to have to correspond to the reality out there means that you would need to sort through what those Vietnam veterans' perspectives were, wherever they were when this stuff happened. You'd have to sort through that, what they could and couldn't possibly know from where they were, and then complete the picture, the objective picture, so to speak, of what really happened. So I had examples of this that I kind of cut my teeth on at seminary. I had Siebert Becker from the LCMS for a seminary professor. I think he was the single most influential professor on me. And he would set up things, the alleged contradictions in the Bible. And, Matthew 28 contradicts the opening of Acts because it says the ascension took place from two different spots, one in Galilee and one just outside Jerusalem. Well, of course, they're not actually talking about the same incident. So you'd say, well, no, you've got to read the books that you're citing here. And then he'd tell this story about a guy who one newspaper reported that he died in a car accident, and the other newspaper reported that he died from a stabbing. And it turned out that, in the way he told it, it turned out that the guy who had been stabbed was being rushed by an ambulance to the hospital when the ambulance became involved in an accident. You see, so if you can't see things through, you can't use the notion of truth in there. Now, of course, this is under serious attack, so that's what relativism is. There's no such thing as truth, and we can talk about that a bit with one or two of the writings coming up yet. I should also report that the Aristotle's definition of the truth is aggressively rejected today, academically, for the most part. And it's substituted out for the pragmatic or instrumental theory of truth, which says that we'll agree that what you think is true as long as you're a good neighbor, as long as you're a good citizen, right? And that, that's what a lot of people are thinking. I got this from undergrads all the time. I could predict it in the first or second ethics class. As a Christian, I know that abortion is murder, but I also support a woman's right to choose abortion. This is what we call a contradiction and a self-falsification. But it's also caving into a kind of non-theory of truth, really. Now, the postmods are at least honest enough to say this very early in the writings. The first thing we need to do is get rid of Aristotle. Then we'll go on to do philosophy. It's because of that definition of truth. Which, by the way, let me finish that story there. Aristotle's word for truth and Aristotle's word for lie. His word for lie is pseudos. Pseudos. Prefer that. So when Jesus talks about the pseudoi propheti in the Sermon on the Mount, that's Aristotle's term being used to the fullest. And the word for truth is aletheia. So when Jesus is quoted by John as saying, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, it's I'm the aletheia in there. I have a story maybe I can tell you sometime, but I was invited to do some lecturing in mainland China by a Christian professor from a Chinese university. I won't mention his name because getting that on the record can hurt people. But we had met in the United States, and he actually talked to our Lutheran faculty and told us to stop sending Bibles to China and stop sending missionaries to China. And he had our attention right about the start of his speech. And he said, missionaries don't know what they're talking about. They don't explain the Bible at all. And those translations that you're sending are terrible. And he said, what we need you to do is to send educated people to the universities in China to talk about Christ. And so I got an invitation to lecture on truth theory because I could say what this Christian professor could not say at his university of 60,000 some students, which he was one of two Christian professors. And so when we talked about the theories of truth, I could also talk then, I'll spare you the details right now. I had set up, certain criteria for what would be a viable theory of truth. And we went through the three possibilities. And then I said that there's one explanation that pulls together why the correspondence theory works and why it's grounded. And I just can't tell you how things were in that classroom when these students were listening. I'd been doing some of this from German philosophy, and they were following perfectly well, the grad students anyhow. I was zipping around in English all the time. And then I said, there is a fourth understanding of the truth that, as far as I can find, has only been discussed in one book, a Russian book called Pillar and Ground of Truth by Pavel Florensky, which is called the hypostatic theory of truth. Mm-hmm. And then I set out John chapter 14, verse 6. And I said, here is where the criterion, the truth to be known must be loved, is fulfilled. Here is the warrant for correspondence theory that God in the flesh says, I am the aletheia. You should have heard from the back of the room. Ah. I guess I just told the story and they said I wasn't going to, but there's also one of the grad students there, just passed his master's exams. And he said, afterwards, he was guiding us through the city a little bit. And he said, Dr. Schulz, he said, I think I should tell you that I am not a Christian yet, but I think I shall be. So the truth here, the real reason for rejecting Aristotle is to get rid of the aletheia reference that Jesus gives us, so that won't come up in Western thought. But okay, so what more about Plato's cave in particular, or perhaps we want to talk about the relativism?
I just going into this, I was thinking, because like you're saying, this is you get rid of that subjective, like man is the what truth is,
Yeah, the relativism. Yeah,
and just going off the timeline you mentioned earlier. Do you know for the historical aspect of it, if the failed democracy of Athens played a big role in the development of that relativism, and in why this was such a big deal?
yes. So I'm not sure if this is as helpful an answer as I'd want to provide, but one difficulty was that the Greeks did not practice what they preached in their philosophy. So there's a fairly famous story. I think this is about Thebes, and I believe it's after the time of Aristotle. So after all of these grand discussions about the Socratic questions and the story of Plato's cave and Aristotle's definition of truth and the need for leading the good life, the Greeks were at war with Thebes. The Greek city-states, as you know, are always at war with each other. And the Thebans offered a plea for mercy. And the Greeks said, no, we're going to kill you anyhow. And the people said, well, aren't you the people who talked about justice and so forth? And they said, yes, but we also get to do whatever we want to. So it would be an inconsistency between military practice and the philosophy going on. And then I think after that, it is the moral and cognitive relativism that we see in Protagoras that is always there. And it only gets kind of held under control, first of all, by the gospel and by hearing that this is Christ, right? But then also by the philosophical and moral demands of well-defined justice. And so it's always outbreaking. It's always outbreak. It's kind of like what's like the shingles, right? If you've once had chicken pox, you've got that virus there, and when your immune system is compromised or degraded, then it bursts out. And so, since there is um, no learning of morality and ethics, and especially of the scriptures going on right now, that's why postmodern relativism is all the rage. It's all a viral rage, and there's just our immune system is just shot, it would seem.
I'm a little confused over the postmodern relativism and just the political state, just like in the United States, I guess Western Europe as well.
Mhm.
Is there no I should say what's the understanding of truth among the Gnostics? And it seems like that Plato's cave is actually like you have written here, Plato's Gnostic cave too. He's describing Gnosticism and he's saying there's a truth beyond Gnosticism. Is that what you're saying?
There is an acknowledgement of truth in Gnosticism, but it's achieved intellectually. So I use the term metanoia there. That suits Plato's cave. Which would become our word repent. Turn your mind turn. So the question then is, how is the repentance or the change of mind accomplished? So it's a question about the means by which, again. And for Plato, this is a cognitive thing. It's not a matter of faith. So that's what's going on here with Plato. So it's not Gnostics. Gnosticism is a heresy because, well, I think I can give a quick example here. So actually, Plato's cave and Plato's way of thinking about the form or the idea of the good, this actually was picked up by some of the early Christians. Some of the early church fathers did this. They thought, I think, that this would be a way to make Christianity culturally and intellectually respectable right away. We're really teaching Platonism. So the switch out would be something like this, where Plato taught the idea of the good, the Christian repurposing of it would be the idea is an idea in the mind of God. But the fundamental problem is not the idea of the good. The fundamental problem is how do you reach that? And it's just wrong and backwards, no matter how you look at it. Gnosticism is going higher and higher on the strength of better and better thinking, but actually biblical revelation comes from on high and reaches us down in Plato's cave. So if you'd want to do a better version of Plato's cave, here we all are, blind, dead, enemies of God, chained, and looking at our entertainment or where we're thinking this is reality. And what happens? Jesus comes down into the cave. I think you might want to think of do you remember hearing about the news stories? And I think it was Chile, where there was a major cave-in of some sort. And these miners, I think it was like 20 of them, they were trapped a couple miles underground, mostly solid rock. It took weeks, the better part of a month, to drill down through the rock to get a little narrow escape thing. Man, I guess it came out afterwards that those guys had made a suicide pact because it was just so miserable. And I can only imagine, with my bit of feeling the crushing weight of that just by describing it. So what you would want then is something like we've got in that Franzman hymn, where Jesus descends into the cave and breathes our poisoned air, right, to redeem us. And the Gnostic stuff is all backwards on that. So Gnosticism, however, is not relativistic. So Gnosticism is not saying man is the measure of all things. It's rather saying the human being is capable of thinking its way out of damnation. Right?
So what's going on now? I mean, what is our culture so? I mean, obviously, it's relativism. I guess that's the easy answer. But what does it actually mean for people on the street that are really
Right. So let's see. I need some help with this. So one of our LCMS pastors, I think from Michigan, wrote this wonderful book on Gnosticism. Can you help me with that? Pardon me?
Peter Irvine.
Oh yeah.
Peter, yes. So you can find this is a great book to have handy, by the way. And he had an article in the Federalist about a year ago or so, where he carried out some of the theme of his book by mentioning Americans were enamored of Gnosticism, and that's why the amorphous sexual stuff was happening to the point where people were even altering their bodies. Okay, so the way I can get a handle on this is to say Gnosticism is Platonism. So Platonism is what we were describing, and I think that's what Gnosticism is. So the thing is, though, that to use the word Gnostic instead of Platonic gets the mechanism, the gnosis, center stage instead of the origin of this in Platonic thought. But Platonic thought, Gnosticism, and then Neoplatonic thought, those are all that same phenomenon. So are people today being Neoplatonic? Are they being Gnostic? The one thing that I would have to get back to this book, and I really do recommend that book highly. I think the one thing that we are lacking today that the Gnostics had is they had this notion that there is a normative standard. So there is a truth to be thought your way to. We do have the capability to do this. And today, there is such a total denial of that norm that we are living in absolute chaos. I would also say this is the hallmark of Marxist thought, and before Marx, also Hegel's thought that the human species, human beings, are always getting better and better, progressing to more and more freedom on the basis of our social growth. And this is not a norm. This is a denial of a norm. This is Protagoras repackaged. So you'll find that there's a rabid denial of any absolute norm. And that's not quite the case for classical Gnosticism
You said
or Platonism.
their ultimate reality is this notion of endless progress. That just taking the next step is always better than what came before.
Thanks. That's a good way to put the question. So I think that Aaron included a link to my recent essay on progressivism, the stuff that's sent out. So I'm going to I think what we're doing here is first act of the mind on things that seem related and may or may not be, huh? So progressivism, all of this stuff, they take real wonderful, promising titles for what they are. So progressivism is actually, I call this the fire sale of hard-hearted prodigals. So it's an urgent, got to sell this off real cheap because things are on fire, right? Buy it quick or it's not going to be around. A fire sale of people who are unbelievably wasteful of things. So what's going on? Progressivism in the first place is going beyond our heritage in the Western tradition. So I can talk about this, but Western culture is not well defined by social sciences. Social sciences are real good at descriptions. They're no good at normativity. So usually when we have discussions about culture or the word culture comes up, people are assuming kind of a social science description of it as what people in a given place do or the pottery they make or the architecture they have or something. Now, Roger Scruton, 20th century philosopher who died a few years ago, Roger Scruton in a book, Culture Counts, says, no, we need a obviously better normative philosophical definition of culture. So he says culture is shared moral judgments passed from one generation to the next. Okay, so you get rid of the pottery and you get rid of the merely descriptive stuff, and it's moral judgments. So Scruton famously got into quite a bit of trouble in his native Great Britain because he said, I have to raise the question, is there such a thing as Muslim culture? So, what's actually going on is a sort of shared ethos of violence or things, but what are the moral judgments? It's a fair question to ask, however you come down on it. So then what's Western culture? Now, to be culture, there have to be shared moral judgments being passed from one generation to another. But what makes Western culture distinctive is that sharing of moral judgments is done according to Greek patterns of thinking, but with Hebrew and Greek biblical content. You with me on that? So that's a demanding definition of culture. In my experience, most often when somebody mentions, well, you're offending against my culture, that's not what my culture teaches, that's a discussion stopper. Scruton's is a discussion helper. So, and then it is the loss of the biblical literacy and the biblical engagement of Greek thought that characterizes Western culture through the medieval and up to the modern period. That's the problem. Okay. So if we're asking where do we find ourselves today, this is the way I want to say this. We don't have any culture at all. So I don't grant this thought that anything that we want to call culture is culture, and you're not in a position to critique my culture if you're not part of it. I say that's just nonsense. It's also very harmful. So in that definition, we had culture. Perhaps we're in the last days of Western culture, but you can tell that it is dying because the content, the substance of it has been rejected. So we see that consequence nationally here in the United States by the progressives rejecting the sacred texts. Now, I'm not talking this time just about the Bible, though that's included, but the Declaration and the Constitution. So let's see, Woodrow Wilson, a progressivist president, also a Yale, was it Yale president, Harvard president, Ivy League president? Yeah, thanks. And Theodore Roosevelt, also progressive president. They both, in one way or another, said we have to ignore those sacred texts. So Wilson said the only way you can really understand the Declaration is if you stop reciting and reading the first paragraphs. And then Theodore Roosevelt, I'm not sure that this is an actual attribution or maybe somewhat anecdotal, but it would work. He was president during the early 1900s coal strike in the US. I'm guessing you guys would know more about that from here than I would from back in the Midwest. But he said, when people want coal, he had to deal with the strikes for this, right? When people want coal, we have to say, pardon my French, this is the quote, to hell with the Constitution. That's progressivism. So progressivism is the burning of the sacrosanct texts and the hastening on, as you suggested in the way you asked your question, progressing. Also, I think with kind of the inferred notion, it's got to be better. It's going to be better. But this is, as we say, without warrant, this is silliness. So I have another word for this. It is relativism, and it's also chaos. If you want the really proper word, I think we don't have a culture. We have some societies, or a society maybe. And rather than using the word culture or anything like that, you have to acknowledge it's anarchy. And I mean that deliberately. Remember John chapter 1, verse 1? Anarche ein hologos. To be anarchic is not to want an arche, especially the arche, Christ. So that's progressivism. And that is the hallmark of one particular political party right now, isn't it?
It said then you if I can societies like this instead of cultures, is a fair way of saying tribalism as well. So I think about us in this room because we're as varied as we are in thought, we're really about we're all pointed in the same direction. As
Well-
Lutherans, as Christians. But then, you go down the street, well, even to Liberty University, where if you get the microcosm, they're the core of what they actually believe, or what the university is head for. We're kind of pointed in a similar direction, both, but you,
The universities don't believe anything.
in tribalism,
Well, I don't know.
they promote or they
If you want to say it's just clans or cults or yeah, okay, but the universities don't believe anything, do they? I mean, some rare exceptions.
believe whatever their donors believe.
Yeah. So
That belief meant to be with.
I mean, yeah. Well, for now, and I'm going to say again, there's not a faith commitment there. This is just the soup of the day. This is an opportunity to push against any potential authority, but especially God. It's anarchic. It's anarchic.
Well, could I be correct in saying that culture is barbaric? In the fact that using more of, they don't have the language, a written language anymore. Like they use.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're asking there, and maybe that has some legs. But I'll just keep offering the thought that you can't give credit for coherence where it doesn't actually exist. You can't call something ethical if there is not a norm around which that ethics is working. You can't. So when you have relativism isn't your creed, it's your anti-creed. Do you see? So
Some being shared.
Well, yeah, I'm all for charity too, but I think I'm just being honest. Maybe you want to add rigorous in there, I don't know, but I think we're just being honest. So it's not the case that there is something else put in its place. So we're going to take away. Let's just try part of that woke mantra, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, equity. Now, equity is not a replacement for equality under the law. It is the abolition of equality under the law. It's obviously not accomplishing equality in the sense of equality. It's the undercutting of equality under the law. It is anarchic.
So would it be more accurate to refer to what's going on in the progressivism of American culture, not as Marxist but anarchist?
Yes, but then I would say Marxism is actually anarchy. It's anarchy in a very mythological but imposed violence.
Mm. Okay.
Yeah. So this is more first act of the mind thinking, isn't it? So we're looking to get as specific to understand together what we mean by the terms we're using, and this is actually part of the counterinsurgency. To do this kind of careful fellowshipping and thinking together. And by the way, even though we could talk about how we may have different ways of thinking, it's still fundamentally in the Greek mode. Our theology is, our catechesis is, our confession of the faith is, right? So the right response is not to give up or to self-medicate, right? But it is to reply with the grateful thanksgiving for the gift of language that God has given us by using language, or rather letting language form us. And then, of course, and supremely, sharing the words of Christ in his Bible with people. And I think a big, there are two parts here that are hampering our work. One is on the analytic side, which is why I decry the loss or the disdain of philosophical education in our circles. So in the analytic side, we are just not very strong, and a lack of backbone.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's not very Lutheran to cower in your office and think, well, at least we've got some good theology guys. That's not.
I had a man in I have a man in my congregation who has a master's in philosophy, and he says things I never understand. But anyway, we went to he went to, I love talking. He went to a debate at the University of South Carolina between famous atheist and a Christian. And he's sitting there as a trained philosopher, listening to all the arguments, and he says that the Christian decimates all of the arguments, and the crowd cheers for the atheist. And it's like, it doesn't matter that he actually has destroyed his arguments. He's and not in a mean way. It's just a logical way. He's saying he's addressing what the atheist has said. And he said it was really amazing to hear. He really completely won all the arguments, but the crowd loved the atheist.
Thanks for sharing that anecdote. I'm looking forward to using that. I can also mention that in our last session on Descartes, I'm going to talk exactly about that point. So the divorce of faith from reason, which is modernity, means that in the unreasoned passion to get rid of Christ the Logos, you also get rid of the.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
And maybe it's a little bit, it's this first of the three, as well as a definitional. It's like when we say Marxism, and when we have avowed socialists who are running for high office.
Yes.
Are we wrong to equate the two, or do I know there are distinctions between them, but is that you've used the term market, people have used the term Marxism quite a lot, and I understand Marx and Engels and they, um, is that right in
Is it right to identify
to identify
who people are
socialism with
being?
Marxism?
Oh, I see. Okay. I don't know. So part of this activity of first act of the mind would be to ask people, what do you mean by socialism? And kind of test that out, whether they're doing some bizarre usage or whether this fits with the way that term has been used down the years. And the same thing with Marxism. Now, so I can speak, I think, with a little bit of authority on Marxism. I think what basically is happening is all of these terms that are being used, from woke to socialist, the way that they are being used and the things that the people identifying that way are doing, identify them as Marxists. So then your next question for me would be, of course, well, what is a Marxist, or what is Marxist ideology? So Marx's philosophy, such as it is an outcome of two things. One is his enjoyment of Hegel's philosophy. Hegel's a big German philosopher before Marx. And then this is also combined with Marx's passion to change society rather than just to teach people to think for themselves in philosophy or something. So the inheritance from Hegel, very briefly, is two things. The first thing that Hegel, this giant German philosopher at the beginning of the 19th century, taught was he taught philosophy mythologically. I got this from J. Glenn Gray, so this isn't original with me, but he taught philosophy as mythology. So we can catch this when, for instance, in one of his more famous writings, Phenomenology of Spirit, he's doing it in German, so it's the Phenomenologie of Geist. Now, I often think of my sainted, one of my sainted grandmas, how happy she was when I was taking German in high school. And I wasn't reading Hegel at the time, but if I had been, she always, she would always want to spreche a little Deutsch when I'd come over to visit, or she'd visit us. It just made her day, it seemed. And so she would, I can imagine Grandma Verhan just saying, oh, Greg, I see that you're reading Hegel, and that must be a very nice philosopher to read, because he has this title all about the Holy Spirit, right? So what Hegel is doing is he is endeavoring to take the content out of the biblical words and plug in the spirit of humanity, moving on to perfect freedom, which turns out not to have anything to do with freedom either. Right. And then the other thing is Hegel has this thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing, this little circle where you start off with one thing, then it collides with its opposite thought. And then out of that, you get a better synthetic put together thought. And that's how he thinks that he kind of does use the notion of culture. This is how he thinks cultures get better and better and head more toward perfect freedom by the Geist, which is the spirit of rationality propelling everything. Okay, so you got that, but then what Marx does is he wants to make culture change. So he takes that thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and he puts in classes of people and sets them violently against each other. So it's not one thought contradicting the other, and then you're getting better thinking, but it's the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So the owners, roughly, and then the working schmucks. And the working schmucks have to rise up against the owners on the presumption you're going to get a better society, which is, by the way, communism. All right. So the violence of it, and here's where these come together. Society is not actually divided into bourgeoisie and proletariat. That's one way of carving things up. Doggone suspiciously convenient for what Marx wanted to do. But you know what else? You can do the same thing today. Take that same circle from Hegel and where Marx has it on the board and he put in classes of people, you can erase that and you can put in sexual proclivities. right? And set people against each other based on that. Just as long as you get this violent disruption so that the wannabe communists or committed communists can get their way. So if that violent pitting of people against each other, that upsetting, chaotic, anarchic throwing of people against each other, you can note that that is being done today, and it's being done in a mythological basis. So just to say it, the notion of dividing people up by race is, for instance, not a biblical category, right? And also, it's not a real thing. I mean, might take a look, if I may, might take a look, for instance, just at our current vice president, right? And it's instructive to see what happens if you just say something like, well, you know, when I first heard about her in California and when she became a senator, um, she seemed to be representing people of Indian descent because she's from India. And now all of a sudden, she's a Black African American. And you can just think about some sincere little student saying, well, how does that work? And what really happens is you slam that student because people are saying, if you're not white, then you're in our part of the violent equation here. And so you are Black. And how dare you? See, you can even feel the violence anytime it's portrayed or people try to discuss it. So I think
Some of that too.
yeah. And so I think fundamentally it's the Marxism that's the problem. But you have to understand that the Marxism is based on mythological thinking. So this is not, well, yes, but even, okay. So wait, I'm not sure that I agree. There's a whole lot of intellectual Marxism because it's a pragmatic, changing society, quote unquote, philosophy.
So thinking about going back a little bit to um, the opposition that our society seems to be putting between faith and reason. Does that a little bit come out of Kierkegaard, who's reacting against Hegel? Because Kierkegaard says, well, I believe because it's unbelievable in so many words.
Thanks. So that's not quite what Kierkegaard says, as it turns out. No, what? No, it's good to ask the question. I'm not saying that. It's fine to ask the question. But then what we really have to do is we have to look up what absurd means, have the first active mind thing on that. So absurd actually means, this would be a Latin term that would be used for the deaf man in the miracles of our Lord, absurd. So an inability to hear and learn. So Kierkegaard is actually saying, first of all, he's not concerned about society nearly as much as he's concerned about the Lutheran Church, right? Yeah, which is an interesting thing. But he is concerned with the reliance upon rationality and momentum, I suppose, but rationality, when actually faith is not an intellectual product, it's an emotion. So his phrase from Fear and Trembling is, faith is a passion, which is a whole wonderful set of Lenten sermons in a nutshell. Our Lord's passion, we are passive. Jesus gave us justification through our unworthiness. And that's what Kierkegaard is arguing with. And he is taking on Hegel because Hegel, this is another characteristic of modern society, isn't it? Hegel didn't have a norm or a standard, but he said that the society determines what's true or what's right or what you should do or think. The society does. And we can see the utter foolishness of that today in the 21st century. This is about the last thing you want to do. Also, it is relativism. And also, it's the ad populum fallacy. The ad populum fallacy. The appeal to the people, which is,
But if everybody else is doing it,
yeah, yeah, right. Okay, I'm ready to move on to another text. Are you?